The system said everything was fine. Every screen was green. Every alarm was silent. But the pressure kept dropping. Just enough to notice. Not enough to trigger anything. That's why no one checked the line. And that's why what I found stayed there for so long. The first time I noticed it, I almost didn't write it down. The pressure reading dipped by less than a unit, so small it could have been chalked up to temperature or the way the system recalibrated itself at the top of the hour. The kind of fluctuation you learn to ignore after a few weeks on the job. The kind that never turns into anything. But this one didn't bounce back. It held. Not long enough to trigger an alert. Not low enough to flag a warning. Just low enough to sit there. Quietly wrong. I checked the secondary gauge to make sure the primary wasn't sticking. Same reading. I pulled up the digital dashboard tied to the central monitoring system, expecting to see the same deviation reflected there. It wasn't. According to the system, pressure was perfectly stable, exactly where it had been for months. That mismatch was the first hook. Two sources reading the same line. Disagreeing. I told myself it was a local sensor issue. Those stations were old. Some components dated back to the late 80s, retrofitted just enough to keep them compliant. It wasn't uncommon for analog and digital readings to drift apart slightly before maintenance caught up. Still, protocol said to log what I saw, not what I assumed, so I wrote it down. Time, reading, line ID, no comment. Over the next few hours, the dip repeated itself. Always subtle, always just under the threshold, always invisible to the system that mattered. Each time I checked the alarms, silent. Each time I refreshed the dashboard, green across the board. Each time I added another line to the log. By the third entry, I realized something else. The drops weren't random. They happened at nearly identical intervals, like something upstream was briefly resisting the flow before settling back into place. That thought made me uncomfortable, because resistance in a sealed line wasn't supposed to behave like that. If a blockage formed, pressure would spike. If a leak developed, it would fall sharply. What I was seeing was neither. It was as if the line was narrowing for a moment, then relaxing. I walked the length of the station, listening. The constant hum of the pumps masked most detail, but when I pressed my hand against one of the older pipes, I felt a vibration that didn't match the rhythm of the machinery. It was faint, almost imagined, but it was out of sync. Another hook, sound that didn't belong. I checked the historical logs to see if this had happened before. The automated reports showed nothing. Flat, clean data going back years. But when I flipped through the physical binder, the one no one updated anymore, I noticed gaps. Pages missing. Sections summarized in handwriting that wasn't mine, or anyone I recognized. No explanation, no follow-up. Just observed, and no action required. By the end of my shift, the pressure returned to normal. Perfectly normal. As if the entire thing had corrected itself while I wasn't looking. If I hadn't written it down, there would have been no trace it ever happened. I considered crossing out the entries, marking them as sensor error, closing the loop. Instead, I left them exactly as they were, because whatever caused that drop hadn't gone away. It had only stopped long enough to avoid being noticed. And I had the sinking feeling that the system was designed to work that way. By the time my next shift started, I had convinced myself the issue would be gone. That was the unspoken rule of places like that station. If something didn't escalate, it effectively didn't exist. Systems were trusted more than people, especially when those systems had been running uninterrupted for decades. The line I was monitoring was officially listed as legacy support. Built in the early 1970s, reinforced sometime in the 90s, then gradually pushed into the background as newer infrastructure took priority. It still carried water, plenty of it, but no one considered it critical anymore, which meant no one watched it closely. That's why I was there instead of a full-time engineer. When I pulled up the dashboard, everything was green again. Stable, clean, no record of the previous night's drops. The system had already overwritten its own short-term memory, compressing the data into a neat average that erased anything inconvenient. I checked the analog gauge before sitting down. It was already low. Not by much, the same amount as before. The exact same amount. That's when I stopped thinking of it as a sensor problem. Sensors fail inconsistently. They spike, they stick, they jitter. This didn't do any of that. It behaved like something physical, predictable, restrained, almost careful. I traced the line on the station schematics, following its path out into the desert. According to the map, there were no access points for miles, no valves, no junctions. Just a long, sealed stretch of pipe buried deep enough to avoid temperature fluctuation and surface stress. In theory, it was the safest part of the system. I walked the perimeter anyway, flashlight cutting through the dark, boots crunching against gravel and sand. The station itself was quiet, but the pipe hummed beneath my feet, carrying water toward towns that trusted it without ever thinking about where it came from. I knelt and pressed my ear to one of the older segments. The vibration was there again, not constant, not mechanical. It came and went, almost like a slow pulse, out of phase with the pumps, out of sync with everything that should have been controlling it. That wasn't supposed to happen in a rigid steel line. I returned inside and pulled up maintenance history beyond what the dashboard normally showed. Buried PDFs, scanned reports, half-legible documents from contractors long gone. Most of them were boilerplate, corrosion checks, pressure tests, no anomalies detected. But every few years there was a familiar phrase, minor fluctuation observed. Within acceptable variance, no action required. Always the same line. Always the same conclusion. What stood out wasn't what they wrote. It was what they never followed up on. No escalation. No secondary inspection. No physical verification. Just trust that the system would catch anything important. And maybe it did. Just not this. I logged the new reading, again without comment. 2 nights, same deviation. At that point, it wasn't an anomaly. It was behavior. As the hours passed, the pressure dipped and recovered in the same slow pattern. The system remained indifferent. Green lights, silent alarms, perfect compliance. But I couldn't shake the thought that the line wasn't failing. It was adapting. And whatever was causing it had been doing so for a long time. Long enough to learn exactly how far it could go without being noticed. The first thing I did was look for the procedure that told me what to do next. There should have been a clear escalation path. Something that said if readings disagree, verify physically. That's how it worked in theory. In practice, the manual was a patchwork of updates, exceptions, and footnotes layered on top of rules written for equipment that no longer existed. The relevant section was only 3 paragraphs long. It explained how to trust the automated system. It explained how to log discrepancies. And then it ended. No instruction for a manual inspection. No checklist. No authority granted. Just an implied assumption that the system was right and anything outside it was noise. That wasn't accidental. Manual checks took time, money, and paperwork. They meant permits, downtime, and questions. And questions were the one thing this station had been built to avoid. I called the on-call supervisor anyway. I didn't describe what I thought was happening. I kept it clinical. Pressure variance below threshold. Analog and digital mismatch. Repeating pattern. I expected at least a follow-up question. Instead, there was a pause. And then a familiar sentence. If the alarms aren't triggering, just log it. I asked about a physical inspection of the line. Another pause. Longer this time. That line hasn't been opened in decades, he said. If it was a problem, it would have shown up already. That logic bothered me more than the pressure drop itself. Problems don't announce themselves just because enough time has passed. They wait. They normalize. They become background. I asked if there were any restrictions on checking the access hatch listed on the old schematics. There shouldn't even be a hatch out there, he replied. Those were sealed. Not removed. Not documented as closed. Just sealed. The call ended there. No ticket opened. No follow-up email. Nothing to attach my concern to. Which meant that officially, nothing was wrong. But now I had something else. Confirmation that no one expected that line to be physically accessible anymore. That night, the vibration was stronger. I felt it through the concrete floor this time. A low resonance that didn't align with pump cycles or flow changes. When the pressure dipped, the vibration changed with it, tightening, then easing off, like the pipe itself was reacting to internal stress. I stood there longer than I needed to, hand on the metal, waiting for something definitive to happen. It never did. That was the most unsettling part. The system wasn't failing catastrophically. It was holding itself right at the edge of acceptability, as if designed to avoid intervention. By the end of the shift, I realized the truth. If I wanted answers, I wouldn't get them through protocol. Manual checks weren't forbidden. They just weren't supported. And anything that isn't supported eventually becomes your responsibility. I stopped trusting the gauges after that. Numbers could be averaged, smoothed, ignored, sound couldn't. During the next shift, I brought a handheld contact microphone from the equipment locker, the kind maintenance crews use to diagnose bearing issues. It wasn't meant for pipelines, but it was sensitive enough to pick up anything irregular traveling through metal. I told myself this was still within my role. Listening wasn't the same as opening anything. I waited until the station settled into its nighttime rhythm. Pumps steady. Flow stable. The kind of quiet that only exists when everything is supposed to be working. Then I pressed the microphone against the pipe. At first, all I heard was the expected noise. A low, constant rush, like distant wind in a tunnel. Water moving fast, evenly, without interruption. Then the pressure dipped. The sound changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was a subtle distortion in the flow, as if something briefly interrupted the smooth passage of water before letting it slip past again. Not a blockage, not turbulence, something else. I moved the microphone along the pipe, inch by inch, listening. The distortion grew clearer the farther I went. There was a faint, rhythmic scraping, soft enough to be dismissed as resonance if you weren't paying attention, but it followed the pressure drop perfectly. When the gauge dipped, the sound tightened. When the pressure recovered, it loosened. That correlation shouldn't have existed. Pipes don't adjust themselves. They don't respond dynamically to internal resistance unless something inside them can move. I pulled the microphone away and placed my ear directly against the metal. The vibration buzzed through my skull, uneven and alive in a way that made my skin prickle. It reminded me of standing too close to a transformer. Except this felt deliberate. I checked the schematics again, tracing the section of pipe where the sound was strongest. According to the map, that segment ran uninterrupted for nearly 12 miles underground. No valves, no inspection ports, no way for anything to get in or out. And yet, something was interacting with the flow. I recorded the audio, labeling the file with the time and line ID, knowing full well no one had asked for it. As soon as I saved it, the pressure stabilized again. The sound returned to normal, as if the line had settled back into place. I stood there longer than necessary, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't. That's when it hit me. Whatever was inside that pipe wasn't random. It wasn't debris shifting by chance. It reacted. It adjusted itself just enough to stay within tolerances, which meant it wasn't just old infrastructure behaving badly. It was something that had learned the limits of the system that contained it. I spent the next day doing what the system encouraged best. Nothing. I logged the readings. I archived the audio. I told no one. But once you know where to listen, it's impossible to ignore the silence around it. The problem wasn't escalating, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. Anything that stays just below attention has time to settle in. That night, I drove the service road that paralleled the pipeline, headlights cutting across scrub and rock. According to the oldest schematics, there was an access hatch along that stretch, installed during construction, sealed after initial testing, then quietly erased from updated maps. Sealed didn't mean removed. It meant forgotten. I found it by accident. A slight rise in the ground. A concrete ring half buried under sand. No signage, no lock. Just a metal plate bolted down and painted the same dull brown as the desert floor. Weathered enough that it looked like it had always been there, and that no one had looked at it closely in a very long time. I checked my phone. No signal. The first bolt resisted. The second screamed when it turned, metal protesting after decades of disuse. By the time I loosened the last one, my hands were shaking, not from effort, but from the certainty that I was crossing from observation into involvement. I lifted the hatch just enough to let air escape. The smell came first. Not sewage. Not rot. Something metallic, stale, pressurized. When I raised it fully and shined my flashlight inside, I saw the interior wall of the pipe. Thick steel, damp with condensation, water rushing through at speed. Everything looked normal for about a second. Then the beam caught on something that didn't move with the flow. It wasn't lodged cleanly. It wasn't debris caught at an angle. It sat within the stream, forcing the water to split around it, shaping the pressure instead of stopping it. Whatever it was, it had been there long enough for the pipe to wear around it. I leaned closer, heart pounding, trying to understand its shape. The flashlight shook just enough to blur the edges, but one thing was clear. This wasn't something that had washed in by accident. It was too large, too stable, too precisely positioned. Behind me, the pumps kicked slightly louder as the system compensated for the resistance. Still not enough to trigger an alarm, but enough that I could feel the vibration change under my boots. That's when I realized something else. The obstruction wasn't recent. It wasn't even aging. It was integrated. Whatever decision had been made to leave it there hadn't been a mistake. It had been a calculation, one that assumed no one would ever look inside the line again. And as I stood there, staring into a pipe that was never meant to be opened, I understood why. I didn't touch it. That decision came faster than I expected, almost instinctive. Whatever was inside that pipe wasn't something you reached for without understanding the consequences, and I already knew enough to be afraid of what I didn't know. I lowered the flashlight deeper, angling the beam to follow the contour of the obstruction. The water rushed around it in two uneven streams, faster on one side than the other, creating the exact pressure behavior I'd been logging for days. It wasn't stopping the flow, it was regulating it. That realization settled in slowly, heavily. This thing wasn't causing a problem. It was the solution. The surface looked worn smooth, not by erosion alone, but by consistency. Years, maybe decades, of water shaping itself around the same object at the same point without anyone intervening. The pipe hadn't failed around it. It had adapted. I traced the edge with the light and felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The obstruction wasn't centered by chance. It was positioned with intent, braced against the inner wall in a way that distributed stress evenly. If it had been debris, the line would have ruptured long ago. If it had been corrosion, it wouldn't have held its shape. This was placed. I pulled back and checked the pressure gauge I'd brought with me. As long as I kept my distance, the reading stayed within tolerance. But when I leaned in closer, casting more light, the vibration changed. The flow tightened. The gauge dipped. It was responding. Not intelligently, nothing like that, but mechanically, predictably, as if the system had learned a balance it didn't want disturbed. The pipe, the pumps, the obstruction, they were all part of the same equation now. I thought about removing it, just enough to see what happened. Then I thought about the towns downstream, about how much force was being held in check by something no one monitored anymore, about what would happen if the system suddenly had to relearn equilibrium all at once. That was when I noticed the markings, faded paint, old stenciling, almost completely worn away, but still visible if you knew to look. Not warnings, not measurements, identification. Someone had cataloged this thing once, given it a designation, treated it as a component, not an anomaly. I backed away from the hatch, breathing shallow, suddenly aware of how quiet the desert was around me. No alarms, no sirens, no indication anywhere in the system that something critical was sitting inside a pipe where it wasn't supposed to be. I closed the hatch carefully, bolted it back down, and stood there longer than necessary, staring at the sand as if it might give me answers. Whatever was restricting the flow had been left there on purpose, and whatever reason justified that decision, it had outlived the people who made it. I didn't sleep after that shift. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the water splitting around that shape, felt the vibration tightening, as if the line itself had noticed my attention. By morning, curiosity had turned into something heavier, an obligation I couldn't justify but couldn't ignore either. If this thing had been placed deliberately, there would be a record. Not in the system that averaged everything into silence, but somewhere older. Back at the station, I went straight for the physical archive room. No badge swipe, no login. Just a steel door and shelves that hadn't been reorganized since before I was hired. The binders there were thick, mismatched, labeled in fading marker, 1978, 1985, emergency modifications, temporary measures. The wording alone set off alarms in my head. I started with the oldest volume and worked forward, flipping through yellowed pages filled with typewritten notes and hand-drawn diagrams. The language was cautious, almost apologetic. Repeated references to unanticipated load behavior and stress anomalies during peak demand. Then I saw it. A rough sketch of the pipeline cross-section, a shaded shape inside it, annotated with a term I didn't recognize. Not debris, not damage. Flow moderator. I read every page around it slowly, carefully, afraid of missing context that might make it worse. According to the notes, the line had developed a resonance issue shortly after coming online. Pressure oscillations that threatened to tear it apart under certain demand conditions. The fix wasn't immediate replacement. That would have taken months, cost millions, and required shutting down water to multiple towns. So they improvised. They installed a temporary internal restriction, something heavy, shaped to absorb and redistribute pressure. It worked. The oscillation stopped, the line stabilized. And then the paperwork changed. What started as a temporary measure became long-term monitoring. Monitoring became no longer necessary. The component was reclassified, folded into the system, and eventually omitted entirely from updated schematics. No one removed it because removing it meant reopening the problem it was hiding. What froze me in place wasn't the decision itself. It was the conclusion. A note near the end of the section, written in a different hand, years later. Component remains functional. Removal not recommended. No expiration date. No reassessment schedule. Just permanence by omission. I closed the binder and sat there, listening to the faint hum of water moving through a system that still depended on a fix no one remembered installing. The obstruction in the pipe wasn't a failure point. It was a secret load-bearing element. And now, decades later, the only reason it was still doing its job was because no one had disturbed it. Once you understand why something exists, you start seeing the shape of every decision built around it. The flow moderator wasn't forgotten by accident. It was preserved by convenience. I went back through the binders with that lens, ignoring the technical language and focusing on the margins. Who signed what? How often things were reviewed? Where responsibility quietly dissolved? Every few years, someone revisited the line on paper, not in reality. The conclusion was always the same. The system was stable, the risk was theoretical, and intervention would introduce more danger than it removed. They weren't wrong. They were just short-term correct. The cost estimates were what finally made it clear. Removing the moderator meant depressurizing the line, excavating access points that no longer officially existed, and risking a resonance problem no modern engineer had ever dealt with firsthand. The fix had become institutional knowledge without an owner. So they chose the path that required no action. What bothered me was the language shift over time. Early reports described the component as foreign. Later ones called it integral. By the end, it wasn't mentioned at all. The system documentation assumed its presence without acknowledging it, like a missing bone everyone learned to walk around. That explained the pressure behavior. The line wasn't failing. It was compensating for something essential aging inside it. Materials degrade. Shapes erode. Even something designed to absorb stress has limits. The subtle pressure dips I'd logged weren't malfunctions. They were signs of fatigue. The moderator was losing its ability to regulate cleanly, forcing the system to work harder to maintain balance. And the system did what it was built to do, hide that effort. I realized then that escalation wouldn't come from alarms. It would come from a change the system couldn't smooth over anymore. A demand spike, a temperature shift, a moment when the old fix finally stopped being enough. I drafted an internal report that night. Not emotional, not speculative, just a summary. Undocumented internal component, signs of degradation, recommendation for controlled inspection. I saved it. Then I stared at the screen. Submitting it would force the issue. It would trigger audits, shutdowns, questions I wouldn't be around long enough to answer. And if the risk assessment came back unfavorable, the easiest conclusion would be the one they'd always chosen. Leave it alone. If I did nothing, The system would continue pretending everything was normal. If I did something, I might become the reason it wasn't. I closed the report without sending it. That was the moment I understood the real function of the flow moderator. It wasn't just controlling water, it was controlling responsibility. The first real test came sooner than I expected. A heat wave rolled across the region without warning, the kind that pushed consumption past projected limits. Air conditioners ran non-stop. Reservoir levels dipped. Demand surged through infrastructure that had never been designed to flex that hard, that fast. By midnight, the station felt different. The pumps were louder, not malfunctioning, just working closer to their upper margins. The vibration in the floor deepened, carrying a tension I hadn't felt before. When I checked the gauges, the pressure was technically within acceptable range, but only because the system was compensating aggressively. Then the dip stopped. That should have been a relief. Instead, it terrified me. The pressure held steady in a way it never had before. Too steady. No fluctuation, no adjustment. Just a rigid line, as if the system had locked itself into a single solution and refused to deviate. I grabbed my equipment and drove back out to the hatch. The desert was still, the air heavy with heat that hadn't bled off even after sunset. I opened the access plate again, faster this time, less careful. When I shined the flashlight into the pipe, my breath caught. The flow moderator hadn't moved, it had shifted. Not much. Just enough that the water no longer split evenly around it. One side took more force than the other, pushing the pressure into a narrow tolerance band the system couldn't relax out of. I understood then what the system was doing. It wasn't maintaining balance anymore. It was forcing it. The moderator had degraded to the point where it could no longer adapt smoothly. So the pumps were compensating harder, holding the line together by brute force. That rigidity was temporary. It always is. I thought about pulling it free, about restoring full flow and letting the line behave as it was originally designed to. But the reports were clear. Without the moderator, resonance would return, violently. So I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I adjusted it. Using a steel bar, I nudged the component just enough to redistribute the flow more evenly. The change was immediate. The vibration softened. The pumps eased back. The pressure dipped once, then stabilized. For a few seconds, everything felt right again. I closed the hatch and drove back to the station, heart racing. The system registered the change as a minor transient event. Nothing worth flagging. By the time I sat down at the console, all indicators were green. I stared at the screen, hands still shaking. I hadn't fixed the problem. I had extended it. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was part of the same chain of decisions that had kept that thing in the pipe for decades. I had become another reason it was still there. Nothing happened the next day. No alarms, no calls, no reports crossing my desk asking why the system had briefly worked harder than usual. That's how I knew it had held. The heat wave passed. Demand dropped. The pumps returned to their familiar, manageable rhythm. On paper, the line had performed exactly as expected. The transient event I'd caused was already buried in average data, indistinguishable from background noise. I didn't document what I did. I didn't undo it either. Weeks later, a scheduled contractor inspection came through. Not for the pipeline, but for the control software. New interface, cleaner dashboards, better smoothing algorithms. The kind designed to make systems feel calmer, more reliable. After the update, the pressure dips disappeared entirely. Not because the problem was gone, because the system was better at hiding it. I checked the old binder one last time before my contract ended. No new notes, no annotations. The flow moderator remained exactly where it had always been, present only in outdated diagrams and decisions no one wanted to revisit. On my final shift, I stood in the station longer than necessary, listening to the pipes hum beneath my feet. The vibration was there, steady and contained. Managed. The towns downstream were still getting their water. Families still turned their taps without thinking. The system still worked. That was the most unsettling part. The line is still in use. The moderator is still inside it. And the only reason it's holding together is because everyone keeps making the same choice. Don't touch what hasn't failed yet. I left the station at dawn. desert light washing over concrete and steel, knowing I'd never see that place again. But sometimes, when I hear water rushing through old pipes in other cities, I think about that sealed line in Arizona, about how close it runs to the edge, about how many systems survive not because they're sound, but because no one wants to be responsible for what happens when they're finally opened.